There is something you must understand about life that has been hidden in plain sight all along. It is not something you discover outside of yourself, nor is it something granted to you by chance or circumstance. It is a quiet truth, always present beneath the noise of your experiences. Everything you see unfolding around you is not the cause of your state, but the reflection of it. And once you see this clearly, you will no longer live as a reaction to life, but as the origin of it. Now hear this carefully. The moment you assume that everything always works out for you, you are no longer hoping, no longer begging for life to become favorable. You are entering a state where life must conform. You are entering a state where life must conform, not because you force it, but because you have aligned yourself with a deeper principle that governs all experience. That principle is your own awareness shaped into belief. You are not a small creature moving through a random world. You are awareness itself, observing itself through the lens of assumption. What you accept as true about yourself and your life becomes the mold into which experience flows. If you assume resistance, you will meet resistance. You will meet resistance. If you assume delay, everything will feel delayed. If you assume confusion, you will walk through confusion no matter how clear the path actually is. But there is another way of being, a way that has always been available to you. To act as if everything always works out for you is not mere positive thinking. It is not pretending against reality. It is entering a state of certainty so complete that your outer world has no choice but to reorganize itself around it. Let this be understood deeply. Life does not respond to what you want. Life does not respond to what you want. It responds to what you are being. And what you are being is defined not by your words alone, but by your inner assumption, your silent conviction, your habitual feeling about how things unfold for you. Most people move through the day carrying invisible expectations of struggle. They expect delays before they even happen. They expect rejection before they even speak. They expect things to go wrong as if that is the natural order of things. And so, without realizing it, they are constantly rehearsing the feeling of things not working out. And life, being perfectly responsive, mirrors that rehearsal faithfully. But you are being called into a different kind of awareness now. One where you decide not after evidence appears, but before it appears, that everything is already working in your favor. You do not wait for proof. You become the proof in consciousness first. When you act as if everything always works out for you, you begin to move through the world differently. You walk into uncertainty without tightening inwardly. You walk into uncertainty without tightening inwardly. You face delay without collapsing into doubt. You encounter contradiction without abandoning your inner stance. Why? Because your foundation is no longer in what is happening, but in what you have accepted to be true about how life operates for you. And once that acceptance is stable, everything external becomes secondary. You may ask, how can one maintain such a state when evidence appears otherwise? And the answer is simple, yet not always easy to apply. You do not argue with appearances. You do not wrestle with shadows. You do not reinterpret old events to reinforce limitation. You gently return to assumption. Again and again you return, because assumption, when sustained, becomes identity, and identity becomes destiny. Consider how a person who believes they are unlucky moves through life. Even small events are interpreted through that lens. A missed call becomes rejection. A slight delay becomes confirmation of failure. A closed door becomes personal defeat. Nothing is neutral. Everything is filtered through identity. Now imagine reversing that entirely. Imagine a person who has decided not intellectually but inwardly that everything always works out for them. The same missed call becomes protection. The same missed call becomes protection. The same delay becomes alignment. The same closed door becomes redirection towards something better, not because events changed immediately, but because the interpreter of events has changed. And here lies the true transformation. Reality does not need to be forced into goodness. It needs to be re-seen from the standpoint of certainty. Well, to act as if everything always works out for you means you no longer sit in the chair of anxiety, waiting for outcomes to decide your emotional state. Instead, you occupy the state of completion in advance. You feel the quiet confidence of someone for whom things are already resolved even while the world is still unfolding. This is not denial, it is mastery of inner position. There is a subtle shift that occurs when you persist in this assumption. There is a subtle shift that occurs when you persist in this assumption. At first, the old identity will try to reassert itself. It will whisper familiar doubts. It will replay past disappointments. It will replay past disappointments. It will attempt to anchor you back into the pattern of uncertainty. But you do not fight it. You simply do not accept it as truth anymore. You observe it as a passing echo, not a command. And then you return to the feeling, everything works out for me, not occasionally, not selectively. Always, at some point, something remarkable begins to happen. You will notice that situations which once felt heavy now feel lighter. Problems that once consumed your attention begin to lose their emotional grip. You start to move with a kind of inner neutrality, almost calm detachment, because you are no longer assigning final meaning to appearances. This is not indifference. It is trust in the unseen order of things. It is trust in the unseen order of things. You begin to realize that life has always been responding, but you were previously unaware of your role in shaping the response. Now that awareness is active, you no longer live as a victim of circumstance, but as the consciousness through which circumstance is arranged. And so you walk differently, you speak differently, you wait differently. Even your silence carries a different quality. There is no desperation in your energy. There is no urgency born from fear. There is only quiet assurance that whatever is currently unresolved is already moving toward resolution. This state is what allows things to shift without struggle, not because you manipulate outcomes, but because you are no longer in opposition to them internally. Resistance dissolves, and with it, unnecessary delay dissolves as well. Remember this, the outer world is always organized from the inner premise you hold most consistently. If your inner premise is fragmentation, life reflects fragmentation. If your inner premise is struggle, life reflects struggle. But if your inner premise is coherence, order, and favorable unfolding, life has no choice but to mirror that assumption. So you must guard the inner assumption gently but firmly, not through force, but through return. Each time doubt arises, you return. Each time fear appears, you return. Each time evidence contradicts your chosen state, you return again without argument. And over time, something shifts in your consciousness. You no longer feel like you are trying to make life work. You begin to feel like life is inherently working, and you are simply aligning yourself with that truth. This is the difference between effort and embodiment. Effort strains, embodiment rests. When you fully enter the assumption that everything always works out for you, your imagination becomes your dwelling place rather than your escape. In imagination, you do not rehearse problems. You rehearse resolution. You see yourself already beyond the difficulty. You feel the relief of completion. You inhabit the end, not the middle of uncertainty. You inhabit the end, not the middle of uncertainty. And when you consistently inhabit the end, the middle reorganizes itself. Do not underestimate the power of this inner occupation. It is subtle, but it is absolute. The unseen dimension of thought and feeling is the creative foundation of all visible experience. What you hold there persistently becomes what you meet here inevitably. There will be moments when the world appears unchanged, and you may be tempted to abandon the state. But understand, continuity in assumption is what seals it. Not intensity, but persistence. Not emotional extremes, but steady return. A seed does not become a tree overnight, yet it does not question its growth. It simply persists in its nature until the outer form catches up. In the same way, your assumption is already active the moment you accept it. The unfolding is not your job. The occupying is. So occupy it fully. Let the feeling of everything always works out for me become natural. Let it sit beneath your thoughts, beneath your reactions, beneath your interpretations. Let it become the background tone of your awareness. And slowly you will notice that life begins to echo that tone back to you. Events will align in unexpected ways. Paths will open without force. People will respond more favorably. Solutions will appear where previously there were none. Not because the world changed arbitrarily, but because you changed your state of being. And in that realization, something deep settles within you. You no longer need to chase life. You no longer need to fight it. You are no longer trying to bend it into cooperation. You are resting in the awareness that it is already cooperating with the assumption you hold. From this place, even challenges lose their threatening nature. They become movements within a larger unfolding that you trust without needing to see the full picture. And that trust is not blind faith. It is grounded knowing, born from understanding the law of assumption within your own experience.
So continue. Persist gently but unwaveringly.
When the world reflects doubt, return to certainty. When feelings waver, return to assumption. When appearances disagree, return to inner conviction. And one day, without needing to force it, you will look back and realize that everything truly did work out for you. Not because life became perfect, but because you became the consciousness in which everything resolves. And in that realization, there will be no surprise, only recognition. There will be no surprise, only recognition. Because you were always the one deciding the meaning, the direction, and the outcome by the stake you chose to inhabit. So let this be your chosen stake now and onward. Everything always works out for me. And when you begin to live from this inner position, you will notice something subtle yet undeniable. The urgency that once ruled your reactions begins to dissolve. Situations that previously would have pulled you into emotional turbulence now pass through you without disturbing your center. It is not that life stops presenting challenges, but that you are no longer interpreting them as threats to your stability. This is the beginning of true inner freedom. Not freedom from experience, but freedom within experience. But freedom within experience. You are no longer waiting for the outer world to behave in order for you to feel secure. You are already secure, and from that security, the outer world loses its power to define you. There is a quiet strength that emerges when you persist in the assumption that everything always works out for you. It is not loud, not dramatic, not performative. It is steady. It is the kind of strength that does not need validation because it is not built on outcomes. It is built on inner knowing. You will find that even your expectations begin to shift. Previously, you may have expected delays, complications, misunderstandings, but now, without forcing optimism, a natural expectancy of resolution begins to form. You simply begin to expect things to align, not because you are trying to be positive, but because your inner state has been reconditioned. And this is where transformation becomes noticeable in your daily experience. You reach situations that once would have caused tension, and instead of bracing yourself, you find yourself strangely calm. You are no longer rehearsing failure internally. Before anything happens, you are no longer preparing for disappointment as a form of protection. That protective tension begins to fade because you are no longer identifying with outcomes as your source of safety. You start to realize something very important. Most suffering was never caused by events themselves, but by the anticipation of those events, interpreted through fear. And when that anticipation changes, the entire emotional landscape changes with it. So you remain in the new assumption, not as a technique, but as a way of being. Everything always works out for me. You do not say this to convince yourself of something you do not believe. You return to it as a reminder of what you have chosen to inhabit. And each return strengthens the familiarity of the state. What once felt like an idea slowly becomes a natural identity. And from this identity, perception begins to soften. You are no longer rigidly interpreting everything through limitation. You begin to notice possibilities where previously you saw blockage. You begin to sense movement in situations that once felt stagnant. Not because the outer world changed first, but because your awareness is no longer locked into a fixed conclusion. This shift is extremely subtle, yet it is profound. It is the difference between looking at life as something already decided and looking at life as something continuously unfolding in response to your inner stance. There may still be moments where old conditioning rises, a sudden doubt, a familiar worry, a memory of past disappointment trying to project itself into the present. But instead of entering into dialogue with it, you begin to recognize it as an old pattern, not a current truth. You do not suppress it. You do not argue with it. You simply do not accept it as your identity anymore. And so you return again. Everything always works out for me. There is a refinement that happens through repetition, but not repetition of words alone. It is the repetition of feeling, the repetition of inner placement, the repetition of returning to the end state rather than the middle of uncertainty, Over time, this return becomes almost automatic. And when it becomes automatic, you are no longer practicing a principle. You are living from it. At that stage, even your response to silence changes. When things appear still or unclear, you no longer interpret silence as blockage. You begin to see it as preparation, as unfolding behind the scenes, as alignment taking place beyond immediate perception. As alignment taking place beyond immediate perception. And so silence no longer triggers fear. It becomes neutral, even comfortable. This is a significant inner shift because most people collapse in silence. They interpret lack of immediate movement as failure. But in this new state, silence is no longer empty. It is active with unseen arrangement. And so you remain steady. You also begin to naughty, so that your words lose their anxious charge. You speak less from urgency and more from certainty. You no longer speak to convince reality. You speak from what you already accept within yourself. There is less negotiation in your tone, less desperation in your expression. Your communication becomes calmer, clearer, and more intentional. Even your thoughts begin to reorganize themselves around this new inner foundation. Instead of spiraling into worst-case scenarios, they naturally return to resolution. Instead of rehearsing problems, they begin to drift toward outcomes that feel aligned and favorable. This does not happen through suppression. It happens through replacement of identity. When the assumption is stable, everything else begins to orbit around it. And yet, there is something important to remember. The outer world will not always immediately confirm what you are being internally. There may be a delay in reflection, but that delay is not denial. Gordon sails, but that delay is not denial. It is simply movement taking form in its own timing. And during that interval, your only task is continuation. Continuation without pressure. Continuation without doubt. Continuation without doubt. Continuation without checking for evidence as a condition of belief. Because the moment you start requiring evidence before returning to your state, you place external conditions above inner authority. And that breaks the flow. So you do not look outward to decide whether to continue. You continue because continuation is what defines your state. Everything always works out for me. Let this become the natural rhythm of your inner world. Not forced repetition, but familiar remembrance. Not forced repetition, but familiar remembrance. Like returning home after wandering through unnecessary tension. And as you settle more deeply into this inner position, you will notice that life begins to feel less like something you are surviving, and more like something you are moving through with quiet assume. Rance, there is less resistance in your experience, less friction in your interpretation, less emotional volatility in your reactions. Not because life has become simpler, but because you are no longer interpreting complexity as danger. Even when things shift unexpectedly, you remain internally stable, because your stability is no longer dependent on predictability. It is anchored in assumption. And this anchoring is what changes everything without force. There is a point where you stop trying to manage outcomes altogether. Not because you stop caring, but because you begin to trust the deeper order that responds to your inner state. You act when action is required, but without the internal tension that once accompanied it. You act when action is required, but without the internal tension that once accompanied it. You wait when waiting is required, but without the anxiety that once filled the waiting. And in both action and stillness, the same assumption remains untouched. Everything always works out for me. You begin to notice that your life is not random, but responsive. Not chaotic, but reflective. And once this recognition stabilizes, you no longer live in reaction to appearances. You live from the inner decision that shapes appearances. Even your imagination becomes more aligned. You no longer use it to escape reality, but to establish inner certainty. You see things already resolved. You feel outcomes already settled. You experience within yourself the relief of completion before any external confirmation appears. And that feeling becomes your signal. Whenever you lose sight of it, you return, not in frustration, but in calm correction, as one would gently adjust their direction without self-judgment. And
What's self-judgment?
in that gentle correction, the state strengthens again. And as this inner adjustment becomes more natural, you will begin to notice that you are no longer as easily disturbed by contradictions in the outer world. What once felt like a Problem now feels like a temporary arrangement of circumstances that has not yet revealed its final form. You stop giving immediate meaning to events, and instead you allow them to unfold without your premature interpretation. This is a quiet but profound maturity of consciousness. You are no longer rushing to define your life at every moment. You are no longer labeling every situation as good or bad the instant it appears. There is space now between what happens and what you decide it means. And in that space, something powerful is taking place: the dominance of assumption over reaction. When assumption leads, reaction loses authority. When assumption leads, reaction loses authority. You begin to realize that your emotional fluctuations were never caused by life itself, but by the speed at which you accepted appearances as final truth. Now that speed is reduced. Now there is pause, not hesitation, but awareness. And in that awareness, you return once again to the inner stance. Everything always works out for me. It is not a sentence anymore. It becomes a place, a position you return to, a psychological dwelling where you reside regardless of external noise. And from this dwelling, everything is seen differently. Even delays no longer carry the same emotional weight. Even uncertainty begins to feel neutral, almost irrelevant to your inner state. You are no longer interpreting life from within anxiety. You are no longer interpreting life, you are interpreting life from within certainty. And this changes everything without visible effort. There will be moments when the old self tries to reappear. The self that reacts quickly, that panics internally, that seeks immediate reassurance from the outside world. But you will notice something new. You do not fully become that self anymore. You observe it as a pattern that used to define you but no longer does. This observation itself weakens its hold, and so you remain steady again, everything hour. This works out for me, and now something even more subtle begins to emerge. You start to feel as though life is responding before events fully form, not in a mystical guessing sense, but in a quiet inner certainty that things are already moving in your favor, even when you cannot trace how. You stop needing to map every step. You stop demanding visible assurance at every stage. Instead, you trust the movement itself. This trust is not intellectual. This trust is not intellectual. It is experiential. It comes from repeatedly returning to the state and observing that over time, life does reflect it. Not always immediately, not always in the exact way expected, but consistently in essence. And because of that consistency, doubt loses its urgency. Doubt loses its urgency. You are no longer as interested in analyzing whether things are working out. You are simply being the person for whom things work out. There is a difference between these two positions. One observes and questions. The other embodies and experiences. And you are shifting into embodiment. This embodiment carries a different rhythm. You act when action arises, but there is no internal panic behind the action. You speak when needed, but there is no desperation behind your words. You wait when required, but there is no fear in the waiting. Everything becomes cleaner internally. And in that cleanliness of consciousness, outcomes begin to feel less like surprises and more like natural continuations of your inner state. You begin to see that nothing is truly separate from what you have been holding within yourself, not in a simplistic cause and effect way, but in a deeper alignment of consciousness and experience. The outer world is no longer a mystery that controls you. It becomes a mirror that reflects you, and so you become more careful, not in fear but in awareness of what you choose to dwell in internally, because you begin to understand that your inner dwelling is not temporary. It is creative. It is creative. It is formative. It is the source from which your experience is continually shaped. And yet, even this awareness does not create pressure. Instead, it creates ease, because you are no longer trying to fix everything externally. You are simply returning internally, again and again. Everything always works out for me. And as this becomes your natural return point, something remarkable happens in your perception of time. You stop feeling as though everything is delayed or rushing. You begin to feel that everything is unfolding at the right pace, even if you cannot see the full picture yet. Time loses its threatening quality. It stops being an enemy that delays your desires. It becomes an environment in which your inner assumption expresses itself, You are no longer negotiating with time. You are moving through it with trust. And this trust removes a great deal of inner tension that once accompanied your desires. You no longer feel as though you are chasing outcomes. You feel as though you are aligned with them already, even while they are still appearing. This is the quiet transformation that takes place when assumption is lived rather than merely understood. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not create dramatic emotional highs. It creates stability, a stable inner state that does not depend on external confirmation. And from that stability, your entire experience begins to reorganize itself in subtle but consistent ways. Conversations shift. Opportunities appear more naturally. Decisions feel clearer. Resistance feels weaker, not because life has suddenly become different, but because your interpretation of life is no longer filtered through lack. You are no longer assuming separation from your good. You are no longer assuming separation from your good. You are assuming alignment with it. And that assumption, held steadily, becomes the lens through which every comes, the lens through which every thing is seen. So even now, as words continue, the invitation remains the same. Not to intellectually grasp, not to analyze, not to debate, but to return. Return again and again to the inner knowing. Everything always works out for me. And from that return, you do not wait for life to prove it. You live as the one in whom it is already proven, even as the outer forms continue to unfold in their own timing, revealing layer after layer of alignment that was already set in motion the moment the assumption was fully accepted within consciousness, and now you begin to notice something even more subtle than before. It is not only that your reactions have changed or that your interpretations have softened, but that your entire sense of identity is no longer anchored in uncertainty. You are no longer defining yourself by what is missing, delayed, or unresolved. The inner conversation that once constantly measured lack has begun to fade. In its place, there is a quieter recognition, the steady, almost invisible knowing that your life is not unfolding against you, but through you. And this recognition does not come as a dramatic realization. It settles slowly, like something returning to its rightful position within your awareness. You are no longer asking, will things work out? Because that question itself feels foreign now. Instead, there is only the natural continuation of the state you have been occupying, the state that assumes completion before evidence, resolution before appearance, order before observation. Everything always works out for me. And because you no longer treat this as a statement you are trying to prove, it begins to function as a background truth. Not something you repeat to convince yourself, but something you return to because it feels more real than any appearance. There will still be moments when circumstances appear unfinished. Conversations may still feel unresolved. Paths may still look unclear, but something in you no longer collapses under that appearance. You no longer treat the unfinished as failure. You treat it as movement, and this shift changes the emotional texture of your entire experience. If the impatient. Where there was once tension, there is now openness. Where there was once urgency, there is now patience without effort. Where there was once internal contraction, there is now expansion into possibility. You are no longer trying to force life into alignment. You are allowing alignment to reveal itself as you remain steady in assumption. And in this steadiness, something very important becomes clear. The external world has never been the authority over your experience. It has only ever been the echo, the reflection, the delayed expression of an inner position you have occupied consistently enough to externalize. Now that you are aware of this, you begin to guard your inner position differently. Not with anxiety, but with care. Not with pressure, but with attention. Not with pressure, but with attention. You become more selective with what you entertain internally. Not because you fear consequences, but because you understand correspondence. And yet, even this awareness does not become rigid. It remains fluid, gentle. You are not policing your thoughts. You are simply returning when you drift. Returning again. Everything always works out for me. And you begin to notice that this return is becoming faster, more natural. You do not stay away from the state for long anymore. Even when doubt appears, it does not fully settle. It passes through more quickly than before because it is no longer supported by identity. You are no longer the person who doubts as a primary condition. You are the person who briefly observes doubt and returns to certainty. This is a profound reversal. And in this reversal, life itself begins to feel different in tone. Not necessarily different in structure immediately, but different in feel, less heavy, less resistant, less personal in its challenges. You are no longer interpreting every event as a message about your worth or future. You are interpreting events as temporary movements within a larger unfolding, and that removes a great burden from your consciousness. Because when everything is personal, everything feels like pressure. But when life is seen as movement, it becomes lighter to experience. You begin to trust without needing constant reassurance. Not blind trust, but grounded trust in the consistency of your inner assumption. You have seen in subtle ways how your inner state precedes your outer experience, and that recognition begins to stabilize, so you no longer feel the need to constantly check whether things are working. You assume they are, and you continue. You act, but without internal tension. You decide, but without fear of consequence. You decide, but without fear of consequence. You wait, but without inner collapse. Each state of being becomes less emotionally charged and more naturally flowing. And in this natural flow, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel as though life is cooperating more easily. Not because it suddenly changed its nature, but because you are no longer resisting it internally. Resistance dissolves first within you, and then in your experience of the world. And so you continue to return. Everything always works out for me. And the more you return, the less it feels like. Return, and the more it feels like home. A place within consciousness where you no longer argue with appearances, where you no longer question the underlying order, where you simply reside in the assumption that has become more real than doubt itself. Even your perception of problems begins to change. What once felt like obstacles now feels like transitional states. What once felt like end-in now feels like rearrangements. What once felt like setbacks now feels like unseen coordination. And you do not force yourself to see it this way. It begins to appear this way naturally because your inner assumption is no longer fragmented. It is unified, and in that unity, your experience becomes less scattered, less divided between hope and fear, less oscillating between belief and doubt. There is a centralization of awareness around one simple inner stance. Everything always works out for me. And from this center, you are no longer pulled outward by every fluctuation of circumstance. You observe, you respond when necessary, but you are not lost in reaction anymore. There is a quiet distance between you and the immediate interpretation of events. That distance is not detachment from life, but detachment from unnecessary suffering. And in that space, life begins to feel less like something happening to you and more like something unfolding through a law that is already aligned with your inner assumption. And so you continue, not trying to reach an endpoint, not trying to finalize understanding, but simply remaining in the state that has become more natural with each return, allowing everything external to reorganize itself in its own time, while you remain steady in the inner certainty that has now begun to define the very way you experience reality from within consciousness itself. And now you come to understand the essence of all that. Has been spoken. It was never about forcing life to obey you, and it was never about waiting for life to finally become kind. It was always about the state you choose to inhabit within yourself, the inner position from which everything is seen, interpreted, and ultimately experienced. When you truly grasp this, something quiet yet irreversible happens within your awareness. You stop living as though life is something outside of you that must be corrected, resisted, or feared. Instead, you begin to recognize that life is continuously shaped through the assumptions you consistently accept as true. Not occasionally, not selectively, but steadily, as the background tone of your being. And so the real shift was never in the world. The real shift was in identity. To act as if everything always works out for you is not a technique you apply in moments of difficulty. It is a way of being that you return to until it becomes natural, until it becomes the place you reside in without effort. It is the quiet decision to no longer define yourself by uncertainty, delay, or fear of outcomes, but by the inner knowing that life is fundamentally responsive and orderly in your favor. When this becomes your foundation, the need for control begins to dissolve. The need for constant reassurance fades. The need to mentally fight every circumstance disappears. You are no longer reacting to life as it unfolds. You are participating in it from a state of inner certainty. And from that certainty, something remarkable unfolds on its own. You begin to see that what once felt like chaos was only ever an unrecognized order. What once felt like delay was only alignment in motion. What once felt like rejection was simply redirection you could not yet see from your previous state. But none of this is forced. None of this is demanded. It is revealed through your willingness to remain in the state long enough for its reflection to appear. And even when appearances do not immediately confirm your assumption, you no longer abandon it. You no longer trade inner certainty for outer confusion. You remain steady, not because you are ignoring reality, but because you understand where reality is formed. So you persist, not through struggle, but through remembrance. You return, not through effort, but through recognition. And in that return, you discover that you were never separate from the very outcome you were seeking to experience. Everything has always been moving in response to the state you occupy within. And now, as this understanding settles, there is no need to overthink it, no need to chase it, no need to prove it, only the quiet embodiment of it. Everything always works out for you, not as a wish, not as a hope, but as the natural expression of the consciousness you choose to live from, again and again, until it becomes the only place you know yourself to be.